Okay, this is another experimental kind of sewing video on multiple levels again, because I am trying new things with the video, not the least of which is remembering that my DSLR can record video, so I have another camera. But also I'm going to use a pattern that I've never used before. I'm going to use a pattern I've never used before. It's a hat. When I play Animal Crossing, my player character basically wears the dandy hat so often that I've started feeling that hat's absence in my own wardrobe, so I want to make that hat. I thought it was a Newsboy hat, and I thought it was black. I looked things up. The hat that's called the dandy hat in Animal Crossing New Horizons is a Baker Boy cap. The difference is that a Newsboy cap, just the crown goes straight to the head. A Baker Boy cap has a band, so the crown goes into the band, and then that's what makes contact with the head. I know it's not a huge difference, but it's just for people out there who might feel inclined to say, that's not a Newsboy hat, that's a Baker Boy hat. I gotcha. Also, in my research on hats and that hat in Animal Crossing, I discovered that the hat that my player character wears all the time is not black, it's gray. That said, I'm going to make a black Newsboy hat. Now, what I'm going to use is this pattern that I thrifted in a huge thrift grab bag I got a few years ago. It's the Kaleidoscope Cap by Timberlane Press. Copyright 1992. Now in 92 I did wear hats. I wore a lot of hats, but they weren't floppy sewn hats like this. They were like blocked felt hats with, like grapes and things in the hat band, Imagine me as a kid. I wasn't casual enough to wear stuff like this. I was even more formal in the stuff I wore, so the hats I wore were like that. So this says, the Kaleidoscope Cap. This jaunty reversible cap is quick to make and fun to wear. One side is a kaleidoscope and the other is an engineer's cap. Flattering styles for men, women, or children. Make the cap from one fabric or for a quilterly look. Select 2 to 8 different prints for the kaleidoscope. So, I've already said I'm making this in black. So it's not going to have the quilterly look. I also am not going to make it reversible because my whole point in making this is to get a black Newsboy cap. Not an engineer's style. I'm not fond of engineer's caps anyway. If you don't know, an engineer's cap is a lot more basic. There's like a wide band with a top on it and a brim. That's it. There's no real shaping to it. So, the cloth that I have chosen for the hat is also thrifted. It's this black wool crepe that, yeah, I know thrifting like this much black wool crepe is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. So of course I took it with, like most of the cloth in my life, no idea what I would do with it. So even though I'm going to use a very small amount of this for this project, at least I'm using some of it. And even though it's thrifted and there are of course no content tags attached to it, I know it's wool because it makes the inside of my skin itch. Which only happens, I've discovered with wool things, while I'm working with it. Once it's sewn, it's fine. There's no residual itchiness beyond what you normally get out of wool. And for the lining, I'm hoping that I have enough of this, which was one of the fabrics that Nada brought in the massive de-stash of her relatives' stuff she brought last summer. But I think there is enough square inches overall to make this, but it's not the right shape to cut out what I want to make from it, but we'll see. If that doesn't work, I have this, which is also a gift. And I think it has at least some actual silk in it, if not all silk. It's more interior decorating weight. It's not as much of a lining material, but that's okay. It'll work inside this hat. So, time to cut out the pattern pieces. So let's open this up and see what we have. I have looked through this a little bit, and basically the summary I will say is that this is an indie pattern just from about 30 years ago. So it is markedly different from the big four pattern company patterns, and the instructions are very odd. Well, oddly specific. You'll see. And one of the things about this hat, I mean, obviously whoever made this before whoever owned this before had never made it, because not only are the pieces uncut, yeah, I mean, they could have been traced. I know the right thing to do is to trace them. I'm not going to trace them. But it came with this sample piece of a super heavy-duty interfacing called Timtex to use for the hat crown, and it is still here. So, and I also, basically if you give me any bit of information that I don't know what it's about, I'm going to research it. So I found out that Timtex was made for a long time and then discontinued about 8-10 years ago, but it was brought back and it's still available. But most people who make hat brims don't use it. And actually most people who do use it are using it for like art quilt projects like bowls and things. So it was funny, I was looking at the blogs where quilters were talking about this, and half the comments were people saying, do you think I could use this in a hat brim? And the quilter's saying, mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, yes, that's why I'm here. Can you use it in a hat brim? I know that. Anyway, okay. So this is, what you need, and the directions, and then the pattern pieces. So like I said, I know I should trace this, respect the integrity of the pattern, but I'm not going to. Alright, so this is the piece for cutting the Timtex, or any heavy-duty interfacing, or even stacks of regular interfacing. There are lots of options. There are loads of free patterns and instructions for how to make Newsboy caps out there, and they will tell you to use all sorts of things for the hat brim. I have even seen blogs where they used cardboard because they made their pattern by taking apart a commercially produced Newsboy cap with the brim reinforced with cardboard. Actually, I'm going to check something because we have the bill and the bill facing as two separate pieces. However, from what I gathered by looking through the instructions, that facing is assuming you are making this full-on reversible. So I guess this is set up so you can separate your pattern pieces. So you have one piece for the Kaleidoscope side, and one piece for the conductor's hat side, which I will show you. They're not even calling it the conductor's hat on the pattern piece. Alright, let's see. Do these appear to be the same? No, they don't. One is a little bit longer. Alright, I will not doubt you any more pattern. I will just cut out what I'm given. Alright, so those should be the pieces for the part of the hat. And then one piece from the facing, which I'm going to cut from the fashion fabric. So now we need the other pieces, which the description called a conductor's hat, and this calls the very wearable soft floppy hat. Which I'm assuming is another hat produced by the same indie pattern maker who mostly made, I'm assuming, quilt patterns, because their logo is very, to borrow their own word, quilterly. So you could probably make a standalone hat just from this. And then this little bit is one of the weird things about this pattern that makes it, like I said, very definitely an indie pattern. And what is snapping and cracking there? It's a little cool today, so the electronics, the plastic, you know, expanding, contracting, snapping, cracking. Okay. Okay, since the previous segment I recorded, the child has finished his schoolwork, as apparently has at least one of his friends, so they're talking over Discord. Not actually meeting up this time, though. Okay, anyway, time to cut stuff out. Okay, so we have our wool crepe here, which I need to cut 8 pieces out of. And you know that I pretty much shortcut everything possible. I'm going to cut 4 at a time. I know my scissors can't handle cutting through all 8 layers at once. Also, the instructions had you laying everything out at once, or, you know, hat with 8 fabrics, you would cut this out of just each fabric, which the grain is that way. They have it that way on this one, and on this one they have them going with the grain, which, if you know anything about sewing, across the grain from selvage to selvage has a little bit of stretch, even on a firm woven. So that will make a difference to the way a garment drapes on the body, or even the wearability, whether you cut it this way or this way. And so it probably wouldn't make a big difference on something like this hat, especially since you will be gathering it to elastic, so you don't need to worry about the inherent natural tiny stretch across the grain on fabric. But that just annoys me that they don't seem to be saying, okay, this one you cut it with the grain, and this one you cut it across the grain. But anyway, I'm going to ignore this, as I usually do ignore pattern layout instructions anyway, because I've been doing this for a long time. I have a pretty good idea of what I can and can't ignore. Somewhat. And I do tend to use pattern weights, with big asterisk next to that, on larger projects, but they're not real pattern weights. They're just like things from around the room that are heavy, like extra pairs of scissors and spools of thread. But I'm obviously using straight pins now. Anyway, I'm not even sure if I finished my thought before about the way it had you cutting entirely from a single piece of fabric and alternating up and down, which that's not even beginning to acknowledge that you might have a nap fabric, like a corduroy. If you cut a corduroy alternating up and down in your pattern pieces, a napped fabric like corduroy or velvet, velveteen, velour, even to some extent flannel, and knits if you want to get into it, will reflect light differently from different directions. So if you alternate up and down which way you're cutting it out, then when you put it together, it's going to make it look like it's a bunch of different colors. So that's a good reason to observe nap and one-way yardage layout when you're cutting things out. Also, if you're using a print that has a definite up and down, you don't want to alternate up and down. I mean, that's a given. Once you know about things, it's just so jarring to see it like that, the way it's presented in the layout for this. Okay, the reason I just poked the straight pin through that is that's one of the weird sort of indie pattern type directions on here. This first step, assembling the wedges for the cap. With a thick pin, make a hole in the cap, wedge A pattern at the top where the seam allowances cross. Mark dot on the wrong side of each fabric wedge with a marking pencil and the hole in the pattern. So they are telling you to take, they say a safety pin, anything heavy, poke that through, and then mark it. I'm trying to decide if I want to ignore, it says, you know, on the back. And they're actually, this fabric I noticed on the selvage does say face. So I'm assuming that means there is a notable difference between the right side and the wrong side, but when I'm looking at it, I don't really notice it. So I guess I will try to pay attention to that, but I will probably mess up. Okay, which one of these is sharper? We got bluish sharp. So right now, face is up, which means I have used the marking pencil to very roughly mark little blips of blue chalk in the appropriate spot. We'll see how long that stays visible. When I initially had the idea for making this in mind, I was envisioning using a heavier wool than this crepe, but since this pattern is intended to be made from quilting cotton, I figured the crepe weight is probably fine. Alright, so that's the 8 pieces for the crown. So now we need to cut the bill. I did determine that the bill and the bill facing are ever so slightly different size. I don't know why. I'm guessing it's so one pulls the other around a little bit, but we'll find out. Like I said, usually I would just jump right in and start cutting what I think should be done. Especially if I had made the pattern before and had some idea what I was doing, but I'm acknowledging that this time I don't know what I'm doing. So I will grudgingly follow the instructions. Alright, I intensely dislike cutting through a single layer of cloth. Like I said, I'm going to try to follow the instructions at least a little. And I am definitely saving on these larger pieces of off-cut fabric to go into the doll cloth drawers. And maybe someday think about making something black crepe for the dolls. Oh, wait, completely forgot to transfer the markings in that, because honestly, the manual for my DSLR, which the parts about recording have a lot of warnings in it about how if you record for too long, it might overheat, and to keep from damaging itself, it will shut itself off. But it does have, supposedly it will warn you when it's about to overheat. And yes, you just saw that the way I make my marks is I snip into the seam allowance, because I've mentioned that I like to take shortcuts and be a little lazy with sewing, right? Now the interfacing. I am not going to pin this, I'm going to trace this. This stuff has really weird texture. It's kind of like felt, but kind of like imagine the texture of melted polyester felt, but it's not melted into a little lump of polyester, solid hard plastic. It's still felt textured, but it's melted textured at the same time. It's weird. The things that I've read about this stuff says it is perfectly easy to sew through. So even though the pattern doesn't call for it, I don't think. We'll see if there ends up being top stitching on the edge of the brim. Bill. What is it? The bill. The bill. I guess a brim goes all the way around, doesn't it? Okay, now the part I am unsure about. I was trying to estimate it last night with the pieces not cut out of the paper, and yeah, that's not gonna work. And I want to use just the things that I don't have a lot of to make the lining. That's why I'm not getting into my full yardage and getting out other loudly printed things. I mean, this would make beautiful doll clothes too, but I'm not going to use nearly all of it by a long shot. And also completely ignoring the grain, because that's the grain. I mean, I'm still tempted to go get into my cloth and keep second guessing myself on this lining. You don't know how much time I've spent already second guessing myself on this lining. I don't know if you can tell, there's a stripe of slightly different colors here, so I'm going to go ahead and, use that stripe. And then this little bit is used later in the construction to shape things, so that the other option would have been to have cut these out in slightly different shapes and then hope that you don't get them confused while sewing together. The way this one works is all these are cut out in the same shape, and then you shape correct them later with this thing. So I am going to clean up this stuff I've made, the mess that you cannot see, off camera, and put black thread on my machine and put my DSLR away, because that experiment didn't work. But for now, I'm going to stop recording, clean up, load the black thread, and then see where we are. Okay, so it is the next day. After I finished recording the previous segment last night, well, it wasn't even last night. After I finished recording the previous segment yesterday, I cleaned up like I said I would, and then I fell down the rabbit hole of looking into my options for other video cameras I could buy. And A big caveat I had with that was the fact that this is definitely a hobby. I am nowhere near able to monetize. Even if I had enough subscribers to monetize, I don't think I would. So could I really convince myself it was worth it to invest in another camera, even if it was a cheap old one like the one I'm using? I mean, the one I'm using wasn't cheap when it was new, but it's so old now that they are cheap. So I was going back and forth on that. And a lot of you might be saying, why don't you just use your phone? And I will tell you, because we are the kind of people who actually still have landline bundled in with our fiber. And so our phone, cellular phone solution is just a flip phone with a pay-as-you-go plan that we use pretty much for emergencies only. So we don't have a smartphone, except earlier this year someone very kindly gave me their older model, kind of cracked smartphone so I could use it for Instagram and for when I left the house to go to thrift stores. Well, I do use it for Instagram, but of course the thrift store thing stopped happening not too long after I got the phone. So I kind of forgot that the phone was capable of anything but Instagram and Neko Etsume. So the very kind person who very kindly gave me the phone very kindly reminded me that the phone is pretty good with video. So we're trying that now. And so that's where we are with this whole double-pronged project of experimenting with the video as well as sewing this hat I've never sewn before. So it's time to get back to sewing the hat that I've never sewn before. Okay, so next step in the instructions. Arrange the fabric wedges. Pick up wedges 2 at a time, match and pin the top dot. The seam of each wedge is different fabric. Be sure you're sewing the correct seam stitch from the bottom up to the dot. Seam allowance exact 1/2 inch. Okay. Next, sew wedge pairs together to make 2 halves. Match dots, pin, and move other seams out of the way. Stitch from the bottom up to the dot and backstitch into the seam allowance. Press seam allowances to one side and all in the same direction. Yeah, I will see if I decide if I need to actually press or not. Alright, assemble the wedge halves. Pin the top where the wedges come together. Stitch this point to check the match. Remove stitches and try again if the match is off. Or add a button when the cap is finished. That's why, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but that's why there are traditionally buttons on the tops of these caps, is because it's really hard to get those points to all come together perfectly. So if you're mass producing them, it's easier to hide it with a button than to get it perfect. So I am perfectly willing to put a button on top of this if it doesn't work out. And I don't expect it to work out because I never take my time on anything. Let's see, let's put that down to a basting stitch. Make sure everything's going the right direction. Let's see if that's the side. That is terrible. Let's see. Do I want to try? That is unacceptably bad. Okay. Right, maybe it would be a little easier if I had, you know, actually pressed it. But at this point, I'm already starting to ignore the directions. Which is pretty common with the way I sew. Okay, that's better. That's good. I'm going to keep that. Alright. Back down to appropriate stitch length. Not perfect. I have no idea if it's even going to show up on this, but it's pretty good. We'll see if I decide to cover it with a button or not later. Shaping. Okay, some of the wedge has been the top of there should be a nice swirl at the top. Yeah, I didn't get a swirl, but that's probably because I didn't press the seam allowances the way they're supposed to. I'm going with it. Okay. Shaping the cap. Select a center front for the cap and mark this seam with a pin. Alright, I'm going to select the center front as being 90 degrees off from the one that I just stitched. And mark this with a pin. Alright, to shape the cap front, mark and restitch 3 seams, the center front seam and the seams on either side. Draw the seams 1/4 inch deeper at the bottom edge and taper to nothing at 3 inches. Draw this line accurately so your stitching will be right on 1/4 inch at the bottom. Restitch the seams and trim to 1/2 inch. Alright, so that's one seam, and this is the other seam. So, 1/4 inch in. Oh yeah, this is really easy to see. So let's just measure that. Okay. So there's where it will start, and then go up 3 inches, where it tapers to nothing. I know it is telling you to draw this. I am not going to draw it. Okay, so now I need to do new stitching. And it says to start at the bottom and sew up, and there probably is a perfectly valid reason for that, but my brain says start here. trim seams to 1/2 inch. And that's close enough to 1/2 inch, right? Turn the cap right side out and fold along the center front, center back seam. Which one was my center front? Alright, so this is the center front. So that means this is the center back. Alright, fold along those seams. So I know the next step involves trimming, so I'm going to go ahead and put in some other pins to hold things. Place shape correction. Oh, the hat should measure 10 7/8 inches. I'm going to trust things. Place shape correction G along the bottom edge of cap. Pin in place matching dots to cap seams. This piece will not reach the center front or center back of the cap. Carefully cut the bottom edge of the cap to fit the new shape. Trim to smooth any rough spots on the bottom edge. Right here. I'm going to double check, assume. Oh no, that's not where it should be on the other side. Alright, so let's go ahead and seam out the seam. Alright, that's better. Okay. So now those seams are aligned. Oh wait, I have that backwards. That's why they're not lining up. Okay. This is the back. And this is the front, right? Right, okay. So this toward the back, toward the front. So we're going to read less about things. See, I imagine some of you are watching this video because you think I sew better than you do, but in my experience, good sewing, with the big quotes around it, really is just compensating for your shortcomings and mistakes a lot more readily than you do when you're not sure about your sewing skills. Bill construction. Sew bill B to bill facing C. Place right sides near the matching dots. Sew facing C on top. Stretch facing to match bill B. Stitch slowly so the seam is smooth. Restitch any jagged pieces. Trim the seam to 1/4 inch and turn right side out. It's not telling you to clip or notch. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Kind of clip and notch. Alright, so you stretch the one to fit the other. Okay. Matching notches. Alright, so we're still 1/2 inch. No idea. Which side is which side? Wait, okay. So I'm going to clip the seam allowance here on the facing, so maybe I can find it again when it's time to put these together. So it's on the right side. Okay. Trim seam allowance 1/4 inch and turn right side out. I am not going to trim the seam allowance, but I am going to notch. Now, if you don't know about notching, curves are funny because of the seam allowance. When you turn a curve right side out, the amount of the seam allowance is not going to match the amount of the curve. If there's too much seam allowance, you have to make notches in it so those notches can come together without being rumpled. If there's too little seam allowances, you have to make cuts in them so they can be pulled apart and lay smooth. So this is a notch situation. Now technically, if you want to be a little more couture, you alternate the notches so they're not taken out of the bit. They're not taken out of both layers. You'd like take a notch out of the top, notch out of the bottom, but I think we've already established that I'm not exactly couture. Of course, you have to make sure that you don't cut through the stitching. The closer you get to the stitching, the smoother the curve will be, but also the weaker the seam will be because there's not going to be enough fabric to hold on. Alright, turn right side out. Now it gets weird again. Use the pattern for bill interfacing, D, to make a pressing template. Trace the outside curve onto the back of a tablet, a piece of poster board, or tag board. Mark the bottom edges of the bill with a straight line. Carefully cut a smooth rounded edge. Leave the long end for something to hold on to as you press. Put the pressing template inside the bill with the seam allowance between the bill facing C and the pressing template. The seam should be against the facing and back slightly from the edge of the bill. Put the bill smooth and press around the template. Leave the pressing template inside the bill. Insert interfacing D between the bill B and the pressing template. Push the interfacing as close to the edge of the bill as possible. Gently remove the pressing template and pin the interfacing in place. Machine top stitch 1/4 inch from the outside curved edge of the bill. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna have to move over to the surface to do that. Alright, so it is make a pressing template. Put the pressing template inside the bill with the seam allowance between bill facing C and the pressing template. Alright, so the seam allowance, alright, this is C because it has the clip on it. So you put the pressing template under that. And I know this is important. It is important to get the seam allowance on the correct side because then the lump formed by the bulk of the seam allowance will not be visible on the top. That's something I learned by making that mistake myself a few times when I was making colors on shirts long ago. Gotta work hard to make this smooth. And I will tell you, I've never been good with curves. Alright, yeah, and that's the other reason one is slightly larger than the other. So you press it. The smaller one pulls 2 bits on the side. Just trying to get this one lump pressed out. Okay, leave the pressing template inside the bill. Insert interface D, interfacing D, between the bill B and the pressing template. Push the interfacing as close to the edge of the bill as possible Gently remove pressing template and pin the interfacing in place. Alright, so this is the side with the seam cement, so that's C, so we put this on B side. This picked up so much lint. Now, put the camera back and sew again. Okay, now it does say machine top stitch at 1/4 inch from the outside curved edge of the bill. You know me and 1/4 inch top stitching. It's not going to happen. It's going to be less. I don't think I'm going to be able to do the very tiny edge stitching that I like just because of the bulk of this, but I will do the width of this presser foot, which is like 3/16 instead of 1/4 inch. And yeah, as thick as this stuff is, it's really easy to sew. Alright, this is still a little lumpy. Yeah, it's still really lumpy. Hopefully it won't be as obviously lumpy when it's on my head. Alright. Pin the center of the bill to the center of the cap. Pin the sides of the bill to the cap and machine stitch with the cap on top and bill against the machine. Alright, I know I made marks. Where's the marks? I think this is the bottom, this is the top. Did I not? Oh, I thought for sure I clicked into it. I guess I'll do that now. Alright. I guess those are marks I forgot to transfer. Alright, so this is the center front still. Yes, okay. Really, the bill against the machine is not how I would have done it. And I'm going to have to sew that again because I know it deviated from 1/2 inch in several spots. I mean, less than in several spots. It didn't go over. I don't have to pick it out and re-sew it. So, I'm going to do it this way because this way feels more natural. Alright. And now I'm going to real quick tack down these seams that I had to cut through for the side adjustment because they're starting to come unraveled. Which wouldn't have happened if I'd used a tiny stitch like I did on the Halloween jacket, but I don't like using stitches that small. So much bulk. It does not say to trim the bulk. I can't not trim the bulk. I'm just trying to trim seam allowances here, not the actual. Like I said, with the clipping, the curve, you don't want to too close to your stitching because then it will, I like it to fall apart. Okay, that's just so much better, even as that is. Okay. Assembling the lining. Match the dots on lining E, the dots on lining F. Stitch from large dot to large dot with lining side F on top. Stitch the seam up the center back of lining F. Leave a 5.5 inch opening in the seam joining. Lining E and F back. Okay, no. Two pins. Tell me to stop sewing. I'm guessing this is the 5.5 inch opening here. Yeah, close enough. Okay, stitch lining side F on top. Alright, so that's like this, which is how I want to sew it, so that's nice. Alright, that was not great, but it should be fine. Make sure there's no puckers or tucks. Stitch seam up center back. Alright, so that should make the 5.5 inch opening. And since these are both slightly bias cut, I'm going to go ahead and pin them. And make sure not to stretch them because they're bias. Alright, finish up that page. Turn lining wrong side out. Well, it's like that naturally. Put the cap inside the lining, right sides together. The bill will be between the cap and the lining. Pin the center fronts and backs of the lining and cap together. Stitch the cap to the lining around the bottom edge, stitching from the cap side. Make small clips in the seam every 1/2 inch so it will not pull and distort the cap. Pull the cap right side out through the opening in the lining seam. Push the lining inside the cap and press the bottom edge of the cap. Pressing. I already put the ironing board away. We'll see. We'll see. Okay. So center back. Where are you, center back? Good question. Center back? Okay, yeah, it is this one. And I can see where if I had pressed things, that would have helped figure out what goes where. Alright. And this one, stitch the cap to the line on the bottom edge, stitching from the cap side. Alright, so that means this side up. And I'm really not sure what it means by make small clips into this seam every 1/2 inch so it will not pull and distort the cap. Is that what they should have told me to do around the brim too? The bill? Whatever you call that part. Alright. So even though I don't know why they're telling me to make clips here, but well, okay, I gotta redo that. Never mind. Yeah, that's a mess. Yeah, I don't use a seam ripper. I rely on scissors. Sometimes straight pins. It's just how I was taught. It's easier to do when I can see better, but I can't imagine a seam ripper would work that great for me with a bad visual, with my glasses being bad either. These are incredibly sharp scissors, and that does help. It's alright, I'm going to sew this entirely all the way around again from the side they said not to sew it from. Alright, so now we make sure that that didn't buckle and pinch anything on the other side. Alright. Oh yeah, make small clips, whatever. Alright. Pull cap right side out through the opening of the lining seam. Push the lining inside the cap and press the bottom edge of the cap. Do I want to press? What do I want? edge stitch. I will say, as much as I've crushed this, it's still holding the shape pretty well. Okay, so here's the compromise. I am going to press this, but I'm not going to record it. So, once again we roll into another day due to technical issues, but it will be finished today. Alright, so close, yet so far. Stitch the back two sections of the cap, ½ inch from the bottom edge. Stitch through both cap and lining to make a casing for the elastic. Stitch the 3/8 inch elastic through this casing with a small safety pin stitched in the well of the seam. Alright, ½ inch. Back two sections of the cap. Right, so this is the front to the back two. This one. I did try this on, and it actually fits fairly well without the elastic in the back, but I'm going to follow the directions. Alright, I have a feeling my seam allowances are going to be all over the place inside here, so it's going to be a struggle to thread the elastic through, because that's how it usually ends up with me, an elastic, but we'll see. Yeah, we'll go ahead. I have a bodkin I could use, but I'm going to go ahead and use safety pin. Alright, gotta work through that opening in the lining. Yeah. Oh, okay. Actually, that wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. So there's one seam allowance. Hey, I went right through too. Alright, so as far as getting things the right elasticity snugness, I'll pull this one through here. Pin it. Go ahead and take this out. Stitch in the ditch. This is stitch in the well of the seam. It says it's called stitching in the ditch. I mean, this is, I guess, what you get when you have a wearable pattern from a quilting company. Normally I would have the blinds open and bright sunshine on this so I could see really well, but that's not good for the canvas. Wow, is that bad? Sew that any better, any straighter. Alright, hopefully because it's all going to be elastic rumpled, it won't be too visible. Also, who's going to be looking that close at the back of my head? I hope nobody. Alright, so the next step is to try it on and pull the elastic. So I'm going to randomly do this, try it on. Yeah, it could probably be tighter, but that feels fine. Maybe I will do better at sewing in the ditch on this side. Alright, and then alright. And With a ladder stitch or blind stitch, close the opening in the lining. You don't know me, pattern. I'm going to sew as much as possible. So I do this horrible contortion thing where I turn it inside out for as far as possible. Alright, I'm going to stop there because that's where the back centering seam is. Alright, another 1/2 inch seams. Alright, so turn that right side out. That's a much smaller one to deal with. I don't know how much of that we can turn. Okay amount. Yes, I will go through a lot to avoid hand sewing. Alright, so now we're down to this tiny bit that needs to be closed. I'm still not going to hand sew. Again, it's going to be inside my hat. No one's going to look at it. And if I feel guilty about it at some point, I can easily pick that out since it's a contrasting thread and stitch it by hand. Now, about where these come together. It's pretty good. It's not great. So I think I am going to quickly cover a button and sew that on. Now, I do not have a covered button kit. I'm literally going to cover a button. Which, despite the great confidence with which I am diving into this, I have actually never done this before. But, you know, again, nobody's going to be on my head staring. Alright, I am going to do this at least partly correctly and do a proper running stitch and draw that up instead of doing a basting stitch and dealing with that. Hoping I leave it long enough that I can actually use the same thread to sew it to that. probably should have left the lining unstitched before doing this so I could sew this in without catching the lining. Oh well. Trying to hurry because I'm so close to being finished. All right. Now I need to remove the incredible amount of lint and cat hair, and then we'll see how it looks. Okay, so what do I think of this pattern? I think you can tell it was made by people who normally didn't make clothing or accessory patterns. It's a little weird, but I think it worked out okay, and I probably will make it again. As a matter of fact, I already have some cloth picked out that I might use to make it again. So this part of this whole experiment I think worked well. Now we sit down and see how the editing goes, if multiple cameras works for me or not. And you'll see the result of that when this whole video is posted. So, as always, thanks for watching, and who knows what video I'll make next.